All right, so we're back with another of our conversations at España Confidencial. I'm now with Jeff Deist, who's the president of the Mises Institute, and with Bradley Birzer, who is one of the co-founders of the Imaginative Conservative. I am, of course, Ugo Stornaiolo Silva. I am the Hispanic America correspondent for España Confidencial, and this is a new edition of Navarra Confidencial TV. So welcome, gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to have you here because this is really amazing. I've been reading, I think, daily the Mises Wire and the Imaginative Conservative for the past year. So for me, it's really a lot to have two of, well, I think my greatest intellectual influences in the last time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so we usually begin with asking our guests to do a quick introduction of yourselves. So, well, I can introduce you as far as I know you. For example, I know that Dr. Birzer is a professor at Hillsdale College. Mm-hmm. I know that Mr. Deist has been pretty much an advisor for Congressman Ron Paul. So, well, you have quite an interesting background, the two of you. But anyway, I would like for each of you to introduce yourselves to our audience. I would like to begin with Jeff Deist, please.
Well, I'm with the Mises Institute. What we hope to be, or what we strive to be, is an alternative school of sorts. In other words, a place where you can come to learn about economics primarily, but also culture and civilization and liberalism and political philosophy. But as we all know, even before COVID, the idea of what a school is has been radically redefined in recent years. So now a school can be something that you attend on your own time. It can be something you attend strictly online. It can be something where you just consume a tiny little bit of educational content, or you consume big books and many, many years of educational content. You don't have to be 18 or 20. You can be 50 or 60, or you can be stationed overseas, you can be a housewife, you can be all different kinds of things. So what we're hoping is to provide a resource for people, a lot of free books, a lot of free reading. And we push what I hope is, or what I think is, a pretty radical agenda. We're very anti-state, we're very pro-peace, we're very pro-market. But I hope what sets us apart a little bit is that we're also thinking about these things in terms of culture and civilization and law and philosophy. I think libertarianism, if that's a word we want to consider, has lost its way badly. I think conservatism in many ways has lost its way badly. And so we're stuck here talking about culture wars, maybe instead of what we should be talking about.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deist. So now, yeah, it's your turn, Dr. Birzer.
Thank you, Ugo. I'm a huge fan of Jeff, and I'm a huge fan of the Mises Institute and the Mises Institute, and I think a lot of what the Imaginative Conservative does, they overlap in all kinds of ways. So I've been at Hillsdale now. This is my 23rd year. So my career, not something I expected when I first got here, but my career has really been mostly teaching at Hillsdale, and I teach the great books to freshmen and sophomores, so first year and second year students, during their first year and then their second year, really going through primary documents, trying to get them to grasp some of the great authors and the great ideas of the Western canon, and also in the American tradition as well. But then 11 years ago, this summer, in fact, coming up in about a month, maybe a month and a half, we'll be celebrating our 11th anniversary with the Imaginative Conservative being founded. And that has had great outreach in all kinds of ways. And we've tried to be non-ideological. I mean, certainly we're on the right, and we're not very pro-leftist, but within non-leftist, non-ideological circles, I think we're very broad, and we try and have a lot of discussion and a lot of thought and outreach. So it's been great.
Well, thank you, Bradley. So, well, the topic of today's talk was going to be about the culture wars and the free society, which pretty much are something, at least in Latin American circles, we're having a lot of trouble understanding. because I don't think we're really prepared to what's coming. In the United States, you really have a very narrow definition of what a culture war is. What is the current culture war, which are the sides on this conflict, and what is going to be the consequences for society. And well, we tend to think in terms of left and right, but I think that this is a much bigger issue, that we have to consider what Jeff in the beginning talked about, things about civilization and about culture. So my first question for you two is, what do you think the West, what do you think Western civilization or Western culture is, and what's its state right now, its current situation, so to speak? I would like with I would.
I'll say Western culture's on the skids a bit. How's that? I'm very pro-Western culture and Western civilization. I think we should embrace that term. I don't think it has to be geographic anymore. It can be metaphoric. It can apply anywhere. Certainly, it's based somewhat, perhaps primarily on Enlightenment principles. Those would probably include some robust form of individualism, but it's more than that. And I think a lot of the criticisms in our culture today, woke culture, neoliberalism, which has become kind of a catch-all slur phrase, I think a lot of those critiques have resulted from maybe an excess of Enlightenment rationalism. In other words, we're not simply robotic economic actors. We have all kinds of motivations. We ought to have civil and social intermediaries standing between us as individuals and the state. In other words, we ought to have things like families and churches and religion and civic and social institutions. I think those are a big part of what makes society work without an overweening government. And as government in the West, and particularly in the United States, has expanded, I think that culture, civil society, has retreated somewhat. And I think it's left us alienated. I think it's left us nasty. I think it's engendered itself in the politicization, that's a tough word to say, the politicization of everything. And it's got us at each other's throats. It's not working too well. So somewhere along the line, Western liberalism has gotten stuck in neutral, or maybe even in reverse. And I think that both Dr. Birzer and I would have a huge interest in reversing that.
Yeah, I'm in almost absolute agreement with Jeff. In fact, there's nothing he said that I would disagree with. Typically, when we approach, especially at Hillsdale, when we approach the Western tradition, we like to think of it as Russell Kirk presented it, as a series of cities and ways of thinking about life. So we start with Jerusalem, and then go to Athens, and then go to Rome, and then London, and kind of culminate in Philadelphia with the Great Experiment of 1776, and then the U.S. Constitution in 1787. And I think there are probably some things that we could nitpick about that, but overall, I think that's a pretty good iconic way of thinking about Western civilization and what it means. I'm also, in the last century, very taken with John Paul II and his understanding of trying to figure out in the Western civilization, what is the human person, and the idea of the human person as being an unrepeatable center of freedom and dignity, as John Paul put it. And I think that's a beautiful way to think about kind of the best of what we've inherited from the Western tradition. But as Jeff says, we've gone backwards, we've gone wrong, we've taken some side roads that we should never have taken. And clearly, people like Marx and Nietzsche and others, who I think took us down some very dangerous paths in the 19th century, they too came out of the West, and they were also liberally educated and came out of the great books tradition. So there's no perfect solution by any means. They're as much a product of the West as they are a part of the downfall of the West as well. And I think we have to keep that in mind.
Right. Thank you for your answers. Well, in that line, I would like to ask you about a fairly different question, because when we think of the West, we tend to think about the freedom, about the liberty, and of course, about a society that embraces and that promotes both freedom, liberty, and everything that makes a man and a woman free. So my question for you would be, what is a free society? What do you think are the characteristics of a free society?
Well, I would say I think of a free society in terms of political liberty, which means that a human being has the ability, hopefully, to mostly chart their own course in life without undue restraint from government, from the state. But I think the term freedom and the term liberty have been twisted a little bit to mean freedom from constraint, to mean freedom from social opprobrium, or freedom from any sort of hierarchies, or freedom from any sort of family structures, or from having a landlord, or from having a boss at work, or from having to provide your own groceries, or whatever it might be. And so what we might call negative rights has morphed a little bit into a positive rights tradition, which I think is absolutely at the core of the progressive project in the United States today, is this idea that you have rights to certain things which other people have to provide you, and that you're not really free as long as you have to work, or you have to, pay rent, or you have to do these things. And that's a bastardization of the original Enlightenment concept in the West of freedom. And it's also one that grows the state. And I think that's always dangerous. I think we need to look at the 20th century in the West not as a liberal triumph. I view the 20th century in the West very much as an illiberal triumph, following the mostly pretty good 19th century. So I would suspect a lot of people on both the left and the right, libertarians, democratic socialists, would say, well, the 20th century was this big triumph for liberalism. I'm not so sure I agree.
Yeah, I think in many ways, when historians, especially say 500 years from now, look back on the 20th century, they're going to see a century not just of illiberalism, but of ideological unrestraint. And the idea of the killing fields and the gulags and the Holocaust camps were everywhere. They were prevalent throughout much of the globe in the 20th century. And we haven't gotten rid of that, of course. Just think about the debate just a few weeks ago over the Armenian genocide and how heated that got, when it's pretty clear that there were some atrocious things going on. And there are atrocious things going on around the world right now. I mean, especially when we look at what China is doing to its minorities, and there are other places as well where this is happening. But I think, Ugo, one of the points that I would agree with Jeff, but I might put it a little bit differently, is I would absolutely agree. We have to be very careful about the state, and we have to be very careful about where the state goes and how it grows. And I tend to be more, especially in conservatism, I'm on the libertarian anarchist side of things, but I really worry about the swamping of everything with politics. So not just the state, but everything becoming politicized, which of course is related to the growth of the state. And the state feeds on that politicization of society. But we've just seen that in every aspect of society. There's nothing from the moment I wake up until I go to bed. There's nothing that hasn't become political. And that, I think, is very dangerous. And one of the great successes of America originally was that we kept our political sphere so very, very limited. Even someone like an Alexander Hamilton, who believed in a strong state, would never recognize the kind of state or society that we have now because of how political it has become. Even when he was advocating a strong state, he was advocating one over only a certain area within society, and not outside of that area. So I think that that's one of the things that we as a people in America, especially, we've democratized so rapidly, and we democratized almost immediately after the Constitution, that democratization has always gone along with a kind of totalitarian politicization of society as well. And I think that's something that's going to be, even if we could roll back the state, I think culturally at this point, to roll people back from the idea of politicizing everything is going to be very difficult.
Thank you very much. Well, you both talked about certain political categories, such as the right, or libertarianism, or conservatism, and of course the growth of the state. From what I've read, well, I tend to see that both libertarians and conservatives try to reduce the size of the state. But I would like to ask you, what do you think are the main differences between the two, between libertarians and conservatives, especially in the context of right libertarianism?
Well, that's, today I think that's probably rooted in issues, surrounding the Federal Reserve, maybe foreign policy, things like this. And there's a huge leap. I mean, let's be fair. There's a huge leap in saying that we ought to have government constrained to the protection of individual rights and property, and saying that we don't need government at all, and that even police protection and courts and national defense, in theory, could be provided by the market. That's a big leap. And I understand that that's a big leap. And I think that that's not a bridge so easily, a gulf so easily bridged. So, but I think we have to get beyond that and just sort of contemplate what makes for a just and a decent and hopefully prosperous society. And I think, a sort of obnoxious ANCAP type libertarians like myself, we've had to readjust a little bit. I mean, I think even 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said, well, some DMV clerk or some cop pulling you over has more power over your life than all of Google. You don't have to use Google, but if that cop pulls you over, you got to pay the ticket, because if you don't, they're going to come get your car or do something to you, And I think that was just wrong. I think we have to admit that there's a very unholy nexus between big business and big government in this country, and that these are sort of doctrinaire thoughts about what's inside and what's outside the state aren't serving us so well anymore. So I'm not, I'm increasingly uninterested in ideological debates. I'm increasingly uninterested, and I don't mean disinterested, uninterested in talking about, what's right versus what's libertarian. I mean, at this point, we have such a sewer in this country and so much hatred and division. And what I fear is so much economic pain coming. I hope I'm wrong. That we got to put that stuff aside and call it some sort of new fusionism. Call it what you will, but the left isn't joking. That's the thing. The left isn't kidding. When they say things, they mean them. And they're very good at sometimes floating the outrageous trial balloon, mm-hmm. so that the fallback position seems reasonable, right? And that's how the left makes incremental gains. And every once in a while, the left makes the great leaps forward. And if you're against all that, we ought to be thinking more strategically.
Yeah, I'm completely with Jeff on this. Our differences are so minuscule compared to our enemies and what our enemies are doing right now and the kinds of things that they're trying to do to change society so radically. I do want to say that for me, even though I'm speaking for the imaginative conservative and I'm speaking for Hillsdale College, I am truly in both of those places on the more radical libertarian side of conservatism. So my colleagues at TIC as well as at Hillsdale College would not agree with me on a lot of this. But I think if we do want to see a divide, and at least in the American tradition, I think that libertarians generally tend to think of America of 1776, excluding slavery, of course, but they tend to think of America in 1776 as kind of the ideal of what a free society should be. And I think conservatives generally tend to think that America of 1787 is the real, and neocons tend to think America of 1865. They tend to think of those various things as kind of an ideal. I do notice that with my colleagues at the Imaginative Conservative, and we talk about this mostly behind the scenes rather than putting it up front, but they tend to be far more restrictive on things like international trade than I would be. They tend to be very, I can understand their concerns and I can appreciate their concerns, but their response typically is, if China is doing this, we have to respond by retaliating in this, and this way, rather than moving towards a relatively free market in trade. And that, I would think, it's not necessarily a difference of ideas as much as a difference of emphasis of where trade is right now. I tend to find right now there's a real interest among conservatives too of reviving labor unions and trying to find labor unions to really kind of come in and play an intermediary role between some of the huge corporations and huge business and huge government versus who and what we are. Again, I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but I think there's an emphasis on those things. I would also say that whereas libertarians tend to talk in language of liberty, conservatives, especially traditional conservatives, tend to talk in the language of smallness. They love small things. They love small republics. They love small farms. They love small businesses. They love small government. And it's not necessarily a difference overall, but it's a difference of emphasis and the way that they're thinking about these things.
Well, thank you again. Well, I both heard Jeff and you, Bradley, talking about certain intermediate bodies. For example, Jeff, in a point, told us about church and family. And right now you told us about, for example, labor unions and so on. So, well, from what I've read, most libertarians don't really tend to think about these small communities, while most conservatives do. So I would like to ask you both, what do you think about intermediate bodies and about, well, a tradition of families and churches and small cities and so on as a countermeasure against the state, instead of being the individual against the state or the individual against the government?
Well, it's very, very difficult because we've gone in the other direction. We have very much created a society of unrooted people, of restless people, of people who don't have a lot of connection necessarily to family or to things that are bigger than themselves and outside themselves. And of course, what's naturally going to compete for their affinity is the state. We all want to believe in something. And I think this notion that's actually quite prevalent in libertarian circles, that when we finally get past this tired religious nonsense, this mysticism, and get to, the true promise of a reason-based society, a scientific society, then we'll be much happier, and that it's a religion that's sort of keeping us in the dark ages. And I think that's quite wrong. I think that libertarians are going to find that secular America is actually a nastier and more brutish place than they imagine. And so I don't really care what someone's internal constraints are, whether that's their own individual secular morality, whether that is their parents would get mad at them, whether that's something their teacher or their religious tradition tells them. I just want them to have those internal constraints, because it strikes me that the less we govern ourselves, the more we're going to be governed externally. And look, I mean, we all have a self-interest in this. We all understand in society, you don't just walk down the street and knock a little old lady over the head and take her purse for the $50 inside, even if you could, right? I mean, we don't want to live in that sort of society. So any sort of intermediary institution, which I think the state competes with mightily, is a good thing, because let's face it, we want, for example, strong, wealthy families. When you have individuals who don't live near their other family members, who don't have a particular connection to their town, who move around a lot, I mean, they're very vulnerable. They're more likely to need welfare or government services. They're more likely to not feel part of something, and as a result of that, be really susceptible to demagoguery or political nonsense or promises. And that's something that's near and dear to my heart, because it's a huge schism within libertarianism. Look, I mean, I'll just sum it up with an example. When Mark Cuban was sued by the SEC for insider trading, he said, "No, I'm fighting this. I'll spend an economically inefficient amount of money on lawyers to push back. Because I don't want anyone to think I was insider trading, and I wasn't. I'm going to fight." Well, that's because he's wealthy and because he's an elite. But if any of the three of us were attacked by the SEC for insider trading, we would almost certainly have to just sort of roll over and settle. We'd be worried about, ruining our entire lives or our kids' lives with the lawyer bills. And so that's the difference between elites and the rest of us is they have some power apart and independent from the state to fight back. So I want to encourage dynasties. I want to encourage powerful institutions within society that stand outside the state. That's why it strikes me as crazy when someone like Bill Gates says, I'm not going to leave my money to my kids. I think that's a huge mistake.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I'm a huge fan of both Robert Nisbet and C.S. Lewis, and they both were very, very wary of democratic totalitarianism and how the democratic state can really overwhelm and swamp everything under it, not allowing for these intermediary institutions to flourish. C.S. Lewis, very famously in his Four Loves, said that democracies always hate friendship, because they hate the idea of exclusivity, the idea that we can break apart. And every friendship, Lewis said, was a sort of secession, because it's a way of saying, I can only find in this friendship or in this marriage, whatever it may be, I can only find it a kind of satisfaction that society as a whole can't. And therefore, every friendship is a rebuke of society overall. And I think there's something very profound in that attitude. And we've, in modern America, we have become so, again, politicized in so many different ways. And to look at 2020 and to look at things that were happening with the Black Lives Matter movement and other things that were happening in 2020, the riots, it was so much of a move towards not just politicizing things even further, but taking control of the state in order to have whatever brave new world. In fact, they're now, if you look at what's going on in Washington, I think we're beyond brave new world in terms of radicalism, where we're at. But they certainly want to create their own society, and they can only do that if they can control families, if they can control schools, which generally schools, except for homeschooling, which is one of the great successes of modern America, except for homeschooling, they control almost everything. I mean, you'll get a weird little college like Hillsdale that'll fight it. But, at some point, they're going to overwhelm us. I mean, at some point, we're not going to be able to fight back simply because the rules will change. And I dread that day. I think everybody at Hillsdale dreads that day. But we're one of the last holdouts. But as Jeff said, interestingly enough, our churches have done an amazing job of maintaining their independence from the federal government. There's always the possibility that the federal government will tax churches. There's always the possibility that they'll regulate them, that they'll come in and do something. But thus far, of all of our intermediary institutions, and I think this is true of Protestants as well as of Roman Catholics, maybe to a lesser degree with Roman Catholics. I think Protestants may have been a little bit better about this. I'm speaking as a Roman Catholic, but I think Protestants have done a great job. They have maintained their independence from the state. And every little congregation and every little parish has been able to kind of maintain that and do that. They've done a better job than schools have done in maintaining their independence. And they've done a better job than the family has done in maintaining that independence. So I at least in the American tradition, I applaud that. And I hope that keeps going for a long time. Businesses in so many ways, especially after COVID last year, small business is in a horrible situation right now and only barely recovering. Big business, of course, is in cahoots with government and has been for a very long time. So business is not necessarily our ally. There are certain businesses out there that are allies, but business overall has really been playing too hard the political game for too long. So I think if our churches give up, we're in a very bad situation, not just morally, but politically as well.
Well, you talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and the COVID thing, and well, we have also the rise of the woke and of cancel culture and of critical race theory right now in the United States. We have them being exported to Latin America and to other places. So that we could begin to talk about the way the left is acting right now with those issues. For example, I would like to ask you, what do you think this is happening? What do you think that they are pushing right now so hard to create conflict between people?
Well, Ugo, I'll just say on behalf of my countrymen, I'll say sorry for that export because we'd rather send you. How about can't we send you a Ford Taurus or something? I mean, talk about made in America. You know, it's interesting that Emmanuel Macron in France said, we're not going to have this in France. And Americans like to joke around about the French a little bit. And this is actually a subject that's near and dear to me because I have a Parisian sister-in-law. And, you know, say what you will about the French, who have always accepted, you know, sort of a left-wing worldview that's quite different than the American bourgeoisie or whatever. But they do care about Frenchness. You know, for all their faults, they understand and sort of have a natural affinity for Frenchness. And, you know, we seem to have lost that here. What's keeping us together? You know, what makes us a country or a nation? And when I think the answer is not much, then you get a series of skirmishes, which are political and which have nasty sort of winners and losers. So that's cancel culture, that's wokeness. And there's a very real sense that elections in America now have become a sort of a harm ritual where one side has to vanquish the other. And so when Donald Trump somehow managed to upset Hillary Clinton, there were millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans, who almost felt like they were living in some sort of occupied country politically. And that, you know, Donald Trump not only didn't represent them, but was actively hostile to their interests. And there are certainly tens of millions of Americans who feel that way about the Biden administration now. So in a country of 320 million, and that's the one place where, you know, Latin America tends to have a little more, at least cultural and social cohesion. Most people are Catholic, let's say. The populations are smaller. But obviously Brazil has huge unrest. Mexico has huge unrest. You know, to say what brings us together, well, the answer is not much. And so we duke it out politically, and cancel culture, wokeness, these things are just sort of the you know, the skirmishes, the little firefights in a so-called democracy. I hate it. I don't want to be at war with anybody, even culture wars. Nobody wins, almost by definition. That doesn't mean they don't have to ever be fought, but it means nobody wins. And so for me, you know, who is the aggressor and who's acting in self-defense? Because both sides tend to think of themselves as defending themselves against the other, and both sides tend to try to portray a victim status. In my very strong opinion, the left is the aggressor in America and in the West in the culture wars, but I certainly understand the argument otherwise.
Well, Jeff has stated it beautifully. I can't top that at all. I think the left has to be the aggressor in many ways because by nature, conservatism tends to kind of tend to its own. And so you don't have a lot of conservative middle-class families out on the streets fighting because they're too busy trying to make their lives work. You get these radicals who have this free time and for whatever reason, and there are a variety of reasons, but they're able to be on the streets and do these things. And they're in Portland and Seattle, and they're constantly agitating, and they're a kind of permanent political class of unrest. But I think one of the, at least as a historian, one of the things that's very interesting to me is I think, and Jeff may disagree with this, but I think we've been unraveling as a people since about 1991. I think that the last really great personality that united most of us, not all, there was always opposition, but I think Ronald Reagan was the last person who gave a kind of sense of purpose and people could rally behind. And I think his successor, George Bush, was a huge failure in all kinds of ways. But I think the very fact that we started going on these foreign adventures, not that we haven't done that in the past, but we've been on permanent foreign adventures since 1991, I think this has really divided us as a people, even when we can kind of ignore those things on a day-to-day basis. That is, the average American can ignore those things. I think that it has really changed our whole political situation. And I think it has allowed for us to unravel and become this nation of kind of warring factions in a whole variety of different ways. And I think there are complicated arguments going on there. But, you know, I'm 53. And so I was born in 1967. I missed 1968. I was too young to know what that was like. But my mother tells me horrific stories about 1968 and what 1968 was like. And we're in this period now, 50 some years later, a half century later, we're going through one of those periods of unrest. And the left is not, I won't say they're united, but they're united in their opposition to the right. The right is not united at all. And this goes back to what Jeff was saying. We have to figure out a way to create a kind of new fusionism that will allow not only to oppose what's going on in the left and to call them. One of the things that drives me crazy about the left is they're very good at using moral language when they're absolutely immoral and amoral, but they're so good at claiming that moral high ground. And I think we conservatives and libertarians, we need to be much more upfront about just calling them not only on their immorality and their amorality, but by also proclaiming a certain sense of morality. I think Ronald Reagan is the last person as a national personality who gave us a voice and was able to challenge those ideals. And he was a critical figure, but nobody has come since then that has given us that kind of unity and has allowed us to give us purpose. So I think one of the great deficiencies of the right in America is that we're not confident and we've lost our purpose. We have no real unity, and we have to figure out what that is. I don't think a hardcore nationalism is the kind of thing that's going to unify us. And I don't think a hardcore populism is the kind of thing that's going to unify us. But I'm not exactly sure what is. I think there will have to be elements of the nation and there will have to be elements of the populace in some way of trying to promote an agenda against the left. But I don't know what those are. And I wish I had a solution to this. But somehow we're going to have to figure out what it is that we stand for, not just what we're opposed to.
Did we lose you, Ugo?
I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm having some troubles with my connection. So I use my phone and I use my computer.
Okay. Well, let me add something real quick to what Bradley Birzer just said, which is, we don't have unifying figures in America anymore, right? Even outside of politics.
Exactly.
Sports figures, celebrities, big CEOs like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, everyone now is, Dolly Parton. It doesn't matter. Everyone now is viewed through a political lens. So the smart ones just keep quiet and avoid it. But we don't have Johnny Carson at night. We don't have Elvis. We don't have
John Wayne
or John Wayne. We don't have these figures in America. And you see how athletes have to tiptoe around on Twitter. So on the one hand, we have celebrity culture ad nauseum. But on the other hand, we don't have any, we don't have Muhammad Ali's or Pele's. These people just don't exist in society anymore because if you're famous and if you're rich, the left expects you to come down on their side of things publicly. Yeah. Not just agree with them, but publicly proclaim in some sort of sinister Soviet fashion your adherence to these new tenets of wokeism. And boy, it's just a miserable way to run a country.
Yeah. But what do you think is the alternative to that? Who do you think can take a role as a unifier or of some sorts, or for example, as some kind of local leader or something? Because there has to be some alternative. We can't be like that. We cannot be so alienated from all of the rest of us.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I say let's break up. Pure and simple. I'm not here to try to convince 100 million Americans necessarily to read 900 pages of Human Action over the weekend. We might be a little past that. And breaking up is always imperfect. It always has winners and losers. It's always fraught, unfortunately, with the potential for violence. But the question is, what's the alternative? I think Tom Woods said something, and I'm going to paraphrase him here. Political arrangements exist to serve us, not the other way around. And the Declaration was written about, I consider the Declaration a much superior document to the Constitution, but it was written about, hey, when things aren't working, we have the right to dissolve them. And everybody understands this. And so if you can't walk away from a political arrangement freely and peaceably, then that's not a liberal society. So anyone who calls themselves a liberal or a progressive, yet denies other people the right to walk away, I think is a big hypocrite. Now, in the United States today, we don't have neat dividing lines along geography. Even in the bluest and reddest states, there are deep red rural parts or deep blue cities. So, are some people going to be made worse off or disenfranchised? I think that's probably the case. I think if Catalonia were allowed to leave Spain, there are a lot of Catalans who would be very upset with that. And there are a lot of Spanish, the rump state, the remaining state, who would be very upset about losing Barcelona, a world capital. We're not talking about Alabama here. We're talking about Barcelona. But nonetheless, I think that's the only way, as imperfect as it may be. I think the idea of peaceful secession. Ludwig von Mises wrote about this at length. He was writing about this a century ago in the interwar period. And that's really at the heart of liberalism, is allowing other people self-determination, whether we like it or not. I don't want people in blue states to wake up worrying about who Alabama elects to the U.S. Senate. I think we just have to move beyond that. It's too late.
I would also say, and so you go to at least try to answer your question maybe in a slightly different way. I'm not as pessimistic maybe as I sound. I actually do think that there is some hope. I don't know exactly where it's going to come from, and I don't know if it's going to come from a personality. Traditionally, personalities have either been very unifying or very disunifying, depending on where we look in American history. I mean, there have been a lot of strong personalities. But I will say this, I do think that the left, by its very nature, has one great idea, and that great idea is equality. I think they pervert it, but they have that one idea. That's all their morality. Almost everything that they justify is based at some level on the notion of equality. And equality at some level is very, very healthy. It is very good. I mean, equality before God, equality before the law, these are very, very good things. But what the left has done is they've basically filtered everything through this lens to the point where they're not really talking about equality anymore. They're talking about those who in the past have been repressed will suddenly become the superior. That is where I think we have to be very careful about their morality, because they're making the victims into potential victors, but they would do the exact same thing that once happened to the victims. And I think that the left overall is very, very shallow, and I think they're very hollow. And I think the ideas that you brought up, things like critical race theory or the woke, these are fads. There's nothing. 900 pages of Mises's Human Action is not a fad. That is a serious, weighty argument. It is a difficult argument. It is an argument that takes time to make and to comprehend and to promote. But I think in the long run, the left has nothing to base itself on. It is very nihilistic. It doesn't have faith. It doesn't have an understanding. It doesn't really believe in truth, though it has its own truths, but it doesn't really believe in a truth. And I think that it may take a while, but it'll fall. Just like the Soviet Union fell, so too will leftism fall. Now, they may wreak a lot of havoc, and they may create a lot of damage between now and then, and they do. Everywhere they go, they have. But I think that in the long run, they don't really have a prayer. Literally and symbolically, they don't really have a prayer. They're not going to last. And there's nothing in what they say that has permanence to it. It's interesting. It creates anger and emotion. And right now we're in a very emotional period, but I don't believe it can last.
So, well, just to try to find a common ground, the solution for the current problem we're having is simply to resist. May it be by seceding, or may it be by simply resisting within the system. I think that's the common ground. We have to wait and for the left to finally fail. I think that they are not going to let us resist. That's the problem, and that's what we're suffering in Hispanic countries, in Spain, in Latin America, because they are aggressive, and they're coming for us. In the United States, they already have acquired power, but in our countries, they acquire some power, they lose some other, but they are controlling pretty much all intermediate institutions. So for us, it's pretty much difficult. I think it's more difficult than it might be for you in the US. So I think that maybe to resist would be a common ground, but for how long? How much can we resist?
Well, I think you can resist a lot for a long time. Human history shows that sometimes things go up in flames, and sometimes they just sort of shrug, like the former Soviet Union just shrugged. And that doesn't mean there wasn't any friction, for the former Baltics, for Poland, for Hungary, for Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. I mean, there was some friction. There were some hard times and some hard years. But, I'm looking at this increasingly in my own mindset, less and less in purely materialistic terms. I mean, I certainly want America to be wealthy and prosperous, but that's not all there is to it anymore. If you told me we could only have today's level of material prosperity, but we could have improvements in other parts of life, I think that's a bargain I would accept. So I don't know. I don't know what to do. If I knew, I guess I'd be doing it or at least writing about it. But strategy is very difficult because by definition, the left is action, the right is reaction. That's the nature of things. In other words, conservatives, at least in theory, want to be left alone, and progressives want to progress. So it's hard, something always beats nothing. And as Bradley explained, the left has an animating impulse in egalitarianism. They may not actually believe it. They may be big fat hypocrites, but they have an animating impulse. It's awfully hard to fight that with what? What's the right's animating impulse? Constitutionalism? Too late. Limited government? Too late. God? Too late. Family? Too late. What is conservatism now? I mean, I am very interested in conservatism in the paleo sense of the word, in the old right, the Nochian sense of the word, so it's not something which I would say it ought to be abandoned philosophically or anything like that. I'm just talking about as currently constituted. When I look at the Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans, when I look at National Review, I just see a morass. And I think in the sense of that underlying egalitarian impulse, the left is more organized.
I still, this is probably the only thing I've disagreed with Jeff on at all. I actually still like National Review, and I think National Review has some good things going on for it. And I turn to them fairly frequently to kind of see where they're going and how they've responded to certain things. I won't say they're perfect by any means, but I have appreciated the fight. Maybe that fight that was there with Buckley was a little stronger than it is now, but I appreciate the fight that they put up. Just speaking personally here, I don't know. Yeah, this is really personal. But one of the ways that my wife and I have fought and tried to do the right thing is we've tried to have a good marriage. We've had 7 kids. We didn't have our 7 kids to fight the left. I mean, that's not why we had them. But there is something about having a big family that speaks volumes, I think. And we've been called, when we've been out in Seattle and we've taken family trips out there, we've been called names. I mean, it's no big deal. I mean, I'm very proud of my kids and I'm very proud of my family, and I'm extremely protective of my family. And if somebody can't see that or can't see the beauty in a child, I mean, that is really their loss. So, I mean, I think there are things we do, and not just me. I mean, I think there are things that conservatives do. We go to our work, we do our best, we teach, we try and think, we try and keep our neighborhoods safe, we try to keep people in check. I think there are things we do, but they're so piecemeal. And I think Jeff is absolutely right. They are, in a sense, reactionary as opposed to actually being directive. And that's where, want to make my view all about Reagan, but I do think that in a lot of ways, one of the great things that Reagan was able to do was he articulated a positive vision. And John Paul II articulated a positive vision, not just a reactionary vision. I mean, in fact, one of Reagan's greatest books, which he never gets credit for, was a 1968 book that he wrote called The Creative Society, in which he took the very Misesian argument that what made free societies so important was, and what made them so great, was that they allowed for true creativity at every level. And that creativity multiplied. And once you had one entrepreneur, you had 10 entrepreneurs, you had this competitive sense, but it was competition that was incredibly healthy because it brought the best out of everybody. That's a beautiful vision. And at the time when other conservatives like a Whittaker Chambers was saying, look, it's all going to hell, Reagan said, no, not at all. In fact, all we have to do is show that those societies like the Soviet Union, they're the ones going to hell because they basically are living in a form of hell. They're not allowing the natural goodness of the human person to thrive. I mean, that was right. And I think that was what was John Paul's great success too. He didn't just say, well, these other people are wrong. In fact, he may have been justified saying that a little more often than he did, but he really focused on what held us together and what created a kind of good humanity. And I mean, Poland falls, Soviet Union fall. I mean, and in large part, I think it's because of the kind of positive vision that people like Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II were promoting at that time. And I think about the great work that Jeff's doing at the Mises Institute. I think about the good work my colleagues are doing at Hillsdale. I mean, we really are trying. And yeah, we fall down, but we're trying to do something positive, and we're doing that in our families, and we're doing that elsewhere. I can't, unfortunately, speak to what's going on in Spanish-speaking countries very well. I know that in Spanish-speaking countries, especially since independence throughout much of Latin America, there has always been a huge divide between the left and the right in ways that I don't think Americans really experienced until the 20th century, and then only sporadically. Now it's becoming more a permanent part of our culture. That's very deadly. In all kinds of ways. It's deadly for us. It's deadly for other parts of the world when America starts getting into that situation. But one of my great friends, Bruce Fronin, who I think has done some excellent scholarship, shows that one of the greatest successes of America was the passage of the Bill of Rights. And it was the really last kind of great non-ideological debate in the Western world, where you have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists actually coming together, and not without problems, not without great stress, but they were able to make this compromise and bring this thing together. And that is, I mean, when you think about it, something like the Bill of Rights in American history is a truly great success at every level. I think that's one of the great advantages, but that's where we have been blessed, however we want to put it, not to have been as ideological as other countries attaining their independence had been. America, from the beginning, had a kind of conservative streak in the best sense, non-political sense, of trying to restrain that political impulse.
Yes, I think you're both right. Well, the problem with Latin American countries is that we're receiving a huge influence of that, poorly understood individualism that is actually turning us on each other. And we have been receiving this from the independence days. And for us right now, we're receiving a huge influence of American culture. We're receiving a lot of our own internal problems and so on. And so we're in a different, more difficult situation than the United States, but we have always been. So I think that we tend to look to the United States, for example, and when we see the US is in turmoil, as we're losing hope. I think that your message is very good in that sense, because both Jeff and Bradley are talking about retrieving some kind of idea of freedom, of a family, of a community that is not grounded on the power of a state, but in the power of the people, and by the people for the people, so to speak. So I think that's the greatest message that you people in the right in the United States can give to us people in the right in the Hispanic countries. So well, I think that we can conclude our talk, but we still have some questions in the comment section. So I will read them to you. So there's a user who is asking Jeff about his Spanish nationalist friend. I think that's Daniel Acalle.
Yeah, Daniel Acalle is an absolute force of nature. Lives in Madrid, has a bunch of kids himself, and was in London for many, many years. He is, I don't know anybody who straddles US and European markets with more skill. I mean, he can talk to you about Euro bonds, every bit, and the ECB as skillfully as he can talk to you about the US Fed. He's someone who is, I guess we'd call him an independent economist in the sense that he makes a living by not only his own personal investing, but by basically just writing and speaking. And, without he does run a fund, but without an underlying, university or a fund to tell him what to say and do. So I love him. I think he's great. And he's also very culturally, I think, Rothbardian, Hoppian.
Yeah. Well, for Bradley, there's a comment from our Twitter celebrity, Natalie, who says that she needs to go to Hillsdale. She has to visit Hillsdale. Well, I've been very interested in going to Hillsdale as well. And well, to return to the Mises Institute, I was at the Mises, I think 2 years ago in 2019, but since the COVID and everything, well, it's been really difficult from us in the southern hemisphere to move elsewhere.
I had the great privilege of going to the Mises University. I think it was now back in 1995, but I went with a good friend of mine, Jim Otteson, and we spent that week and had a great time. I would encourage anyone who wants to come to Hillsdale, please do. We have a beautiful campus. Of course, you've got to put up with Michigan weather. So right now, I think today it got up to about 60 Fahrenheit, but we've been in the 40s recently. It's a little different than Alabama. In all kinds of ways. But yeah, I mean, it's a great little college, and we've got amazing students and really a great faculty. And I think we've been trying to fight the good fight since about 1844. So trying to do good things here. But thank you.
All right. So I think that with all that's been said, I would like to thank you very much for joining me today. It's been really great because, well, I've been reading a lot of the articles by both Jeff and you. Jeff has his articles posted on the Mises Wire website, yours on the Imaginative Conservative website. And I think I have some of my favorites. For example, I think that there was a talk that Jeff, he spoke somewhere, and he told that the people that were attending that we have to better ourselves and we have to be men and women that we're successful, because if we're not successful, no one is going to hear us and to really think about what we're saying. So that really struck me. And an article I read about the 6 or 7 characteristics of a conservative that Bradley wrote a while ago, and yeah, that was very, very influential for me. So thank you very much. It's been pretty much a dream to speak with you two at the same time.
Likewise, I'm glad Jeff and I have corresponded, but we've never actually talked. So this is great.
Thank you, Ugo, for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ugo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I hope to have you again in the channel as soon as possible.
Anytime. Thank you. Thanks, Ugo. God bless.
God bless.